Mr Chairman, this is the most ridiculous part of this bill. What this part of the bill does is force some electricity companies, one electricity company, namely Meridian, to give up some of its power stations on the Waitaki River and transfer them to Genesis. Now what that means is that you have less efficient use of the resource. So rubbish we hear. Who said rubbish? It's absolutely clear that you have less efficient use of the physical resource. Instead of having the coordinated use of that water sequentially through the different power generation facilities on the Waitaki system, from Tekapo through the canals, through Ohau, through Benmore, through Aviemore, through the Waitaki system, you're going to have separate owners running separate dams on that system. So there will be coordination issues when it comes to the release of water. There will be different players in having control of those different assets, and they'll have different views as to what they should be doing with the water when. There can be no more efficient use of that water resource than having it under the control of a single player. If our market is so inept and so uncompetitive that we have to actually cause changes which cause resource inefficiency in order to have more market competition, then you have to conclude that the market is so fundamentally flawed that we should ditch it. It is ridiculous that we less efficiently use the resource that causes that can be used for the generation of power in order to get a more efficient market outcome. It is a nonsense that we are going to use our physical resource, that is the hydro resource, less efficiently in order to try and engineer some improved market outcome. And this change was panned virtually universally by all of the submitters who came to the Select Committee. Whether they were generators or retailers or industry commentators or people expert in the operation of the electricity system, virtually universally they said, this is crazy. It does not make sense to use the physical water resource less efficiently in order to have a market outcome. Because if you lose that water less efficiently, what it means in effect is that some of that water will be used at times when it shouldn't be. Some of it will be being used when it's worth less, when it should be being saved for use at its most crucial times. So, Mr. Speaker, if our market is so uncompetitive that we have to contrive through the forced sale of assets in a nonsensical way from Meridian Energy to Genesis, then not only do we ruin the Meridian brand, which is currently 100% renewables in respect of their own generation. Again, why would the government do that? I think the reason for that is bloody mindedness. You know, we have Jerry Brownlee, rather than standing for renewables, New Zealand's already got this magnificent advantage in renewable resources for our electricity generation. But Jerry Brownlee, Sexy Coal Brownlee, remember that's what he called himself in that video before the last election. He doesn't believe in renewables. I doubt if he actually, in his heart, believes climate change is a real or proven threat to the world, and he would actually rather see more thermal generation. In fact, rather than celebrating more renewables, he's always out there when he's digging up a bit more coal, tried to do it in national parks, or trying to bring forward gasification of coal or more sources of coal, all of which produce greenhouse gas emissions which aren't produced by renewables. So what do we have? We have a minister who, I know that the board of Meridian and the chief executive of Meridian and the Meridian staff structure just think it's absolutely abhorrent that they're being forced to take thermal generation assets which produce greenhouse gas emissions because of course Meridian Energy has branded itself on being 100% pure and clean. Now Jerry Brownlee's definition of 100% pure is obviously similar to the Minister of Tourism's view of this, and he doesn't mind this brand, which is valuable, Mr. Chairman.
I call the Honourable David Parker.
He obviously doesn't mind besmirching that brand by forcing this ridiculous obligation on them to take thermal assets. Mr. Speaker, he then modified that right at the end, I think, did he, Mr. Hipkins, and said that they could just put the water assets to Genesis but not require them to take the thermal. Is that correct? I'm not sure either, and perhaps another member can clarify that for me. But the idea that they should even consider doing that was ridiculous. Returning to the first point I was making, it is an absurd idea that this Parliament should legislate to reduce the most effective use of the Waitaki water for hydroelectric generation. It just defies belief that the government would be so stubborn as to persist with this ridiculous plan against the advice of virtually every submitter to the Select Committee. Mr. Speaker, this will not reduce the tariffs for residential users. This will not narrow the overly large gap between residential and industrial tariffs in New Zealand. This will not cure the problem of the higher tariffs that are paid by places like Alexandra, sitting right next to the generating facilities on the Clyde Dam, the Roxburgh Dam, the Tevet scheme and all of the other schemes up in central Otago. It will not cause those tariffs paid by residential consumers in Alexandra to be closer to those which are paid by consumers who are further away from the physical generation assets but happen to live in bigger centres of population. Mr. Chairman, this part of the bill will not fix that problem. There is nothing that this will do that will substantially limit the price increases that consumers are facing. It will not materially improve competition, and there is absolutely no justification for using the physical resource less efficiently in order to try and engineer some improvement in the market. And in fact, it is an acknowledgement by the government that the market is seriously flawed. Otherwise, why would you inflict upon the system a decrease in the efficiency of the use of the physical resource? That must be its only justification. It's not a good enough justification, but that can be the only justification, that there are significant market imperfections currently. And we know that in the absence of a proper market, there is insufficient constraint on price increases, and residential consumers effectively bear the brunt of that through higher tariffs that they pay through this system which is not sufficiently competitive. It is time for us to acknowledge, in my opinion, that the Bradford reforms have not worked. They plainly didn't work in lines, and I think you have to conclude on the basis of the differential between residential and industrial tariffs, which is out of whack compared with the rest of the world, and the fact that we have such lack of competition and at least in significant parts of the market throughout New Zealand, and perhaps in the whole of the residential market, that the system is broken, and that this tinkering with the market rules is not going to work, and that this part of the bill exemplifies how ridiculous it has become. I think that it was Michael Cullen who used to use the example occasionally of how sometimes people make more and more complex changes in order to justify their view of the world. And we used to do that when we had a view of the world that the Earth was the centre of the universe, and we had all of these different orbits explained of everything else in the solar system so as to explain and justify retention of this belief that the Earth was the centre of the universe, when in actual fact the reality was the sun was the centre of our solar system, I should have said, rather than universe. It was the centre of our solar system. Everything revolved around it. Well, it's a bit like that in the electricity market. We've had to bolt on regulation there. We've got more regulation coming here. We've now got these ridiculous changes in respect of the use of the Waitaki power assets, and still the government will not admit what is becoming more obvious and more obvious to every consumer, every residential consumer in New Zealand. We